Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you, featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. Today I'm interviewing Laura Sims. She's an award-winning performer, writer, and educator advocating storytelling as a compassionate action for personal and community transformation. I want to welcome to the Susan Brender Show, Laura Sims.
Thank you so much.
Well, you know, Laura, you perform worldwide, combining ancient myth and true life stories for adults and family audiences. You know, that sounds like a very interesting thing to do, but I'm not really sure what that's all about. So why don't you tell our audience?
Okay. When I first became a storyteller, which was, for a traditional tribe or, an ancient culture, I would have a lifelong training, and it would be known exactly what I was doing. But when I started telling stories, by the way, that is Manhattan in the background.
Mm-hmm.
When I started telling stories, there were very few people involved in it. And my original storytelling happened through a residency I had at the American Museum of Natural History, and I was telling stories from all over the world. Folk tales, myths, profound and beautiful fairy tales, folklore, legends, pieces of epics. And because I was in that context, people came for those stories, and I found that they loved hearing these stories. What I discovered for myself was that the content, of course, was engaging and interesting, but it was the vitality and the rapture of what happens when you listen to a story that compelled me to make it my life's work, because I saw what happened to people as they listened. They completely relaxed. They kind of came alive. But outside of that context, few people knew how to relate to traditional fairy tale mythology. They thought of myths as fantasies that were explanations by people who didn't have science, and fairy tales as stories for children. And my relationship to those stories were that they were almost sort of symbolic or energetic expressions of what is really going on in our ordinary lives when we are less self-preoccupied. So I began including true life stories in and out of and around the telling of fairy tales and mythology to give people a sense of the mythic in their everyday lives and the ordinariness of these very seemingly exotic, symbolic stories. And it was like a magic key in which people love to see their lives mirrored in a story we know so well, for instance, the story of Cinderella. And having a personal story about my own encounters with my stepmother to frame it gave people access to some of the inner confrontations in the story that made it less make-believe and more poignantly real for them. So it's something now that I do on stage that I love. Does that give you more of a sense of it?
Yes, it does. And, I'm just looking at your website, and I see that the New York Times called you irresistible, a major force in the revival of storytelling in America. Now, we don't want to tease our audience. We want to give them information and education, and we also are very interested in how you respond to the notion of vitality. So I would like to ask you to tell a short story, if you don't mind, so that we get a kind of picture of what it's all about.
Oh, my goodness. Well, why don't I tell you, actually, a story of something that happened to me?
Mm-hmm.
And, well, I would say a story that has to do with vitality.
Okay.
After the earthquake in Haiti in June 2010, I was asked by International Medical Corps, IMC. It's something like Doctors Without Borders, but they train people in countries after disasters. They were wonderful. And there were so many orphanages and such vast displacement camps that the head psychiatrist asked me to come and train Haitian health workers to use narrative in the camps and in orphanages. So it was quite a prospect, and I went, and the training was lovely because the people were so wonderful, and they had all grown up with storytelling in Haiti. Whether they were doing it now in the city or not, they were natural in the use of language and the joy with which they could retell stories. And, of course, after a disaster, it was a great relief to tell those stories. And then the second part of the training was that I would go into the camps and into orphanages with groups of the people that I was training, and I would model the storytelling, and also I like to engender stories from people. And then they would do it, and we would have conversations and so forth. And the very first time that I went into a camp, which was in Carrefour, which is a part of Port-au-Prince, that was really hit hard by the earthquake, and it was overwhelming to see the vast sea of tarps that were where thousands and thousands of people who had lost everything were now living. And IMC had a large tent called the Mother and Child Tent, and we went in, and then mothers with babies and children started coming in, and these were people who looked basically exhausted and defeated. And the children, having a clean surface, just sort of lay down on the ground. And I thought they just went to sleep, and the mothers leaned against the tarp like flowers that were withered. And I said to my translator, who was a lovely, lovely young woman, "What am I going to do?" And she just said, "Oh, just start." So I sat down. And suddenly the children all popped up, and they made a line. And they walked toward me one at a time, arms open, and embraced me and gave me a kiss on one or two cheeks, and then sat down. And I said to Vifida, "What are they doing?" And she said, "They're welcoming you." So I began with a story just for the children that had a lot of action, and the children were delighted. She was a great translator, by the way. They were delighted. They just looked like, they just were like pop-ups. They all of a sudden, like eyes wide open, the way a child is anywhere, delighted to be engaged and using their imagination and their body and their voices. And at the end of the story, they would just lie down again. But the mothers were in this kind of state. It was like a lethargy. And it was very visceral, understandable. So I then said, "Now why don't I tell a story for you, mothers?" And I began a Haitian story that I did not know well, and I didn't know the ending. But I said, "I know that this is a great story about a red fish." And I told the beginning of the story. There was once a stepdaughter, it's like a Haitian Cinderella tale, who lived with her stepmother and her father and the stepmother's son. And they didn't like that girl, and they sent her every day to the well to get water. Mm-hmm. And as I started telling the story, one woman started singing a beautiful Haitian song. Something like, "Tezan, mes amis, tezan, tezan ami." And all of a sudden, a few other women started singing. And then they began telling me pieces of the story. And what occurred, what it felt like was occurring, was as if suddenly you took a flower home and it was really withered. You'd gone to the grocery store and on the subway, and miraculously you put it in a little bit of water and suddenly it starts to open. And there were women becoming moisturized.
Oh.
And they sat up and suddenly laughing, singing, and each time they added a piece of the story, I repeated it in English and in French and Viveda, my translator, in Creole. And then together we just brought this story of the victory of a young girl to life. And what happened was a victory of their resilience and vitality. When it was over, I, too, felt, and, I had felt so much fear and reticence at the beginning of what could I do. And I, too, was alive in this exhilarating engagement in which we were no longer just depending on the preoccupation of our mental concepts and exhaustion. Suddenly, the natural resources of our body were accessed, and we all came alive in this mutuality of listening and creating something together. So at the very end of it, I suddenly, Viveda said to me, we must go. It's time to go. And I just thanked everybody, and the women started standing up, and all the women that I had brought to working with me, the trainees stood up, and I promised we'd come back the next day and they would tell stories. And one woman, barefoot, very, very thin, tall, beautiful woman, just said, "Arrête, arrête," to all the other women, "Stop, stop." And then she looked at me and she said, "You know something. We have to thank you. You didn't change our lives today. Our lives are so miserable. But for the time that we were here, you reminded us that we have joy."
That's a very beautiful story, Laura. One of the things that I'm interested in is knowing a little bit about how words of wisdom and storytelling of that nature really does help in a place that is in danger and there's war. So are you telling me that storytelling can be a moment of peace and tranquility?
Well, even in the midst of chaos, when you can access within yourself what in Buddhist terms would be sort of the unconditional, natural state of mind, you can feel an innate quality of calm even in the midst of tremendous chaos. What that does is give you the capacity to feel hope, to be able to tend to what you need to tend, to be aware of the danger with intelligence, and not to fall into the trap of total despair and paralysis in a situation like that. So these wonderful images, they seem to wake up the part of our mind which we would call imagination, but I think it's imagination drenched in the directness of presence. Just wake us up so that we are like opening fruits inside of ourselves that are there that we forget about in those situations.
Yeah. Now, you are the artistic director of the Hans Christian Andersen Storytelling Center in New York. And, we don't know enough about Hans Christian Andersen. I think our young people today don't know. I know because my generation, we saw the movies about Hans Christian Andersen and so much else. So how did that start, and why the Hans Christian Andersen Storytelling Center?
Well, about actually 60 years ago, a Danish baroness who had sat on the knees of Hans Christian Andersen in Odense in Denmark was living in New York City, and as a gift to the children of New York, she had a great sculptor come and create a statue of Hans Christian Andersen in Central Park. It was funded by 1 penny from each school child in New York being collected. So in the late 1960s, quite accidentally, I told a story in front of that statue. And the Baroness, who was in her 80s at the time, passed by, and this is actually how I became a storyteller. She passed by with her very thick, beautiful shoes and her hair with 2 braids tied in the back, and she said to me, "Darling, you are a storyteller." And she told me her story about Andersen and that she had created the statue, which I was standing in front of because it made a natural platform. And so she hired me that summer to be one of 3 storytellers at the time who came and told stories every Saturday for 2 months. But over these 45 years, I have continued to tell stories there. And when the artistic director, a woman named Diana Vogstein, a friend of mine, a very fine storyteller, died suddenly a few years ago, they asked if I would take over the job. And so it has become my delight to schedule storytellers every Saturday for 4 months for free for families, storytellers from all over the world, wonderful artists who appear in Central Park and for an hour and a half tell stories to packed audiences sitting out in the most beautiful part of Central Park.
How special is that? Now,
yes, I also go into the schools and work up in Harlem with low-income kids, telling them stories and training them to tell stories to each other as also part of the Andersen mission.
Yeah. Now, the United Nations, UNESCO, I guess it's the organization called UNESCO, do they promote what you do?
Well, they don't, but it would be wonderful if they did. And UNESCO has a fantastic kind of enduring and forgotten arts that are important. So I have worked for UNICEF, and I have worked for other projects. I'm actually in the middle of November going to go and work for an NGO that works with women in water, telling women in water stories.
Now, you mentioned that you're a Buddhist and you meditate, and I think people don't really know enough about how the effects of meditation, and I would like to understand a little bit more and have our audience understand what is the precepts, what is the sense of meditation when you do it. How does it react? How does it change your life? And also talk a little bit about what it means to be a Buddhist.
Well, I came upon meditation. It really came out of my interest in storytelling and how profound the great storytellers and cultures were. And I began to research it and realize that they had been trained in deep listening, in speaking, and were attuned human beings to their audiences and their world. So it's how I really came to take meditation instruction. And there are many, many different forms of meditation, and particularly now there's so many different kinds available. But I met a Tibetan Buddhist teacher in the late 1970s and took meditation instruction from him, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And the meditation practice is a very disarmingly simple technique that allows you to become familiar with the full nature of your mind. In other words, we're mostly familiar with our thinking. And we're not as aware of the fact of how much sort of resilient space, talking about vitality, how much space there is in our minds that we could always access and relax into, and regardless of whatever is going on, with tremendous passion, with different emotions, but to feel that quality like a kind of subterranean, vast meadow of space that's inside each of us, which actually unites us with each other. But the meditation practice allows one to become more and more familiar with that. In terms of the teachings that I actually give and study, which are called the Shambhala teachings, that my teacher presented into the world so that anyone of any religion or gender or culture could really partake of meditation. So it's secular because the practice itself is good for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that you become calm. It's more that you become more present to what's actually happening and more familiar with your own mind. So you're less reactive to the content of your mind. You have more sense of space and clarity. And that, of course, does give you more vitality because there's less preoccupation and sort of the torment of our mind very often is so exhausting and debilitating. So it is, remembering suddenly, oh, wait a second, I'm attaching myself to that thought. I don't have to. I could actually relax. I have a bigger space, a bigger point of view. I can breathe. So it not only gives one a sense of more vitality, but it actually allows you to have more commitment and control in how you respond in the world so that you can relate to what's actually happening. It's like having a place to come home to inside oneself that, in essence, makes you feel more connected, more compassionate. It's not a kind of, you don't become, again, a stupor or everything is nice and good. It's very alive with whatever is happening. But it's essential. It's like knowing the essential nature of your mind as if we forgot about a part of ourselves. Yeah. So it just is a reminder. So it gives us more relaxation and more energy and more sense of connection.
Can anybody meditate?
Of course. I think probably there are people who have very severe emotional problems or mental problems that it might be harder. But in a way, we all are meditating all the time. It's that we don't know how to access it because we're walking around with our minds in our bodies. Mm-hmm. So we are. Mm-hmm. It is available all the time.
Laura, is it possible for you to do a little demonstration of thinking in terms of if somebody was there and you were their mentor, their meditation mentor, how would you get them started?
Well, there are basically 3 aspects to the meditation technique. And like any discipline or practice, you need a form so that you don't keep making it up yourself. And the first is sitting down in a comfortable seat, whether on a chair or on the floor, a little bit lifted on a cushion with your legs crossed so that you have a sense of upliftedness, so that your heart is open and your back is like a mountain. That's the image. In the practice that I do, the hands are just very gently set, palms down above your knees, so that you're in a very simple and open position. And the eyes are open. There's soft gaze, so you're not closing off the world in order to feel relaxed. You're actually practicing with your eyes open very softly so that for the rest of your day, the 23 and a half hours or whatever, that you can actually access a sense of equanimity or a sense of abiding peacefulness within yourself on the subway, on the train, at work, in the cafeteria, in the gym, no matter where. So the eyes are open, soft gaze. And that's the sort of basic. You need a body to meditate. So there's a sense of just being right there, present, bottom on the ground. Mm-hmm. And then the illusory mission of meditation is actually to place the focus of your mind on your breath coming in and out. So you can never stop thoughts. Thoughts are always happening like waves on the ocean or bubbles from a soda pop can. But we can actually momentarily take our attention from thinking about what we're doing to putting attention on the breath, like feeling the breath coming in and out. And that's the second aspect of meditation. And the third is the juicy part of working with the mind, which is that within moments we start to think. And when we are aware that that we're no longer focusing on the breath, that we just let our thoughts go and put our mind back on attention to breathing. So the moment that you realize that you're thinking, you have a sense of what it feels like, the difference between what it feels like to be caught up in thoughts, like being in a kind of apartment building of your own personal storytelling going on that we're all familiar with, and then letting that go. So it's not that thoughts are not important, it's that we are, in this practice, becoming familiar with the space in our mind as well as the thoughts of our mind. It's probably best to have a real meditation instruction with somebody right in front of you so you can ask questions. But those are the techniques, and that's done from the first day you sit until, for my case, 35 years later, still doing the same practice. So there are periods of time where suddenly it's like, I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But it is so fresh moment by moment. Again, talking about vitality. It is so fresh to be present that it's not actually boring. It becomes a gift of my day to actually work with my mind because I've seen the results of it in my everyday life.
Yeah. Now, you recently appeared at Newark Peace Summit, and this is a conference on world peace and the values of, I guess, the peace. Now, what was that like? And tell our audience what goes on at a summit of this sort.
Well, I think, first of all, it's in a huge theater, and you have fabulously interesting and well-known people starring the Dalai Lama, who has the outrageous capacity to be completely genuine and to talk about his experience of compassion and the nature of peace in a very profound way, in a very simple way, and people who are doing a lot of work all over the world. So it's a very energized situation, and there are lots of sort of breakout groups of workshops. I gave a workshop with someone from the Martin Luther King Center, and we talked about telling stories to promote peace of mind and to sort of short-circuit bias, find common ground by hearing each other's very diverse stories. And so we engaged people in storytelling. And there were just thousands of people, including an enormous amount of young people from Newark, very troubled, interesting city, who were there. Rutgers University had brought them in, and these kids were fantastic. They listened to many, many famous speakers and took notes and had questions. So I think it's a kind of energetic gathering in which people can begin to make baby steps, like receiving this little meditation. You get a baby step, you get an inspiration that if you're interested, you can go and look further into projects or, for some people, just ways of being in your personal life that would promote less conflict.
Yeah. Now, this is kind of something that I think deserves a little more attention, because we live in a world today where there is so many problems, crises all over, people not really wanting to help each other. The computer's taken over, so there are very few people who get together face-to-face. Now, in terms of something like you described, do you think that there's hope for our society. I mean, you're a very positive person. I can see that you look at the glass half full. So, what is your thoughts about all the issues we're having, and do you really have hope?
That's a big question. Do I have hope? Well, I don't think I have like delusional hope, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I think I feel that the possibility of goodness and kindness is endlessly around us. So instead of my leaning into the despair, the confusion, and the deep grief I might feel daily reading a newspaper or seeing how many people are losing connection with a sense of integrity and truth, not having a lot of emotional intelligence being taught to them. So instead of leaning into that, I try to really lean into the situations that have possibility, and focus on how much incredible good intention there is in the world, and try to harvest that even in my own being. Because if I fall into a sense of hopelessness about the world, I become immobilized, and I see everything through that sort of filter of frustration, and it does like destabilizes me and makes me incapable of engaging. So in the way that I do use my practice, it's like rebooting. If I find that I'm going there, and I suggest this to anybody, whether they're practicing meditation or not, I just sometimes say to myself, stop, and I pause, and I hold the storyline of sort of habitual unhappiness or anger or frustration. I hold it away for a second, and I take 3 deep breaths, and I just look out at something and really focus on something, so that I am relieving myself of that sort of loop of misery that can lead to shutting down.
Yeah.
The thing I think is really important for all of us is that we're presented with so many enormous, very, very wealthy people who can do all kinds of things in the world, and very often we feel that we're not doing anything. And I honestly do believe that the smallest act of care, or the smallest moment of waking up, or looking at someone, or smiling at someone, or not getting hooked by anger at the workplace, actually has a tremendous effect. And we can actually just sort of like tap ourselves on the back and say, okay, one less point of aggression in the world. That we never know what is the tiny arc of action that will actually make change happen. So in whatever we do, we have a choice at the moment of how we're going to respond or get hooked.
Yeah.
In severe cases, it's very, very hard. So very often we need other people to remind us, and a lot of the kids I work with, as you said, who are so habituated to being on a digital machine, so that they have lost a way to relax without fear in communication with somebody. There's no, it's not the habit. So there are ways in which, when I was working for Rutgers on a peace project, or a sort of violence prevention project in Newark, in the after school, and I would watch these kids. They found it so hard to sit still, to communicate, and so I had to invent activities and ways while they were listening to the story where they could feel the joy of being able to express themselves and be heard. or what it felt like to receive a compliment and to give a compliment. I had wishing circles. It was it's extraordinary that once we can touch into that place in ourselves, it is so palpably familiar and such a relief. And it is so filled with energy. I mean, part of, when you're talking about vitality, part of the, I think, the equation or the alchemy of making our lives more sane is to hook into who we are, basically, because then there is a sense of the energy that we might think we would get relief of from hooking onto an addiction or escape or aggressing outward as if that will make us feel better. We actually can really contain and feel the energy that's there. And when we feel that energy, we actually can relax with a tremendous amount of energy and even feel strong emotions without doing harm to ourselves and others. And that is a practice to be learned, because we're not learning that in school. No. And we have to come back to these very fundamental human skills. And when we do that, then we feel connected to other people. We feel connected to the natural world. If you're disconnected, it doesn't matter how much data or information proves this or that. You don't have a fundamental experience or knowledge within of that connectivity, so you don't act out of that. Mm-hmm. So my point of view, how do I relax from despair?
Yeah.
Is that I feel the suffering, but I also have a sense of rejoicing because there's small things that I can do that really antidote it. And first I have to do it in myself. Mm-hmm. And then I can begin to bring joy to others.
Well, very interesting. And I want to let our audience know that you're completing a new work called The Sanctuary of a Story. When will that be completed, and how? And just give us a little taste again of what that's about.
Well, the real title is The Girl in the Sky, A Sanctuary of a Story. And it is 12 fairy tales in which I give commentary and activities that people can do, mostly working with young women who have been abused emotionally, sexually, physically, so that it is an indirect way of allowing someone to return to feeling emotions, creating templates for moving through obstacles and finding one's sense of goodness within, forgiving oneself. So I tell many fairy tales, and then I've rewritten them, and then I give a commentary on each of the stories, and then there's activities that people who, say you're a mother whose daughter has been abused, and very often you don't know what to do. So here's something you can do together where you don't have to ask very direct questions about the painful event, but you can allow someone to return to having subtle and rich emotions and feeling self-trust, so forth. It was requested by my editor. I wrote a book called Our Secret Territory, The Essence of Storytelling, which is a wonderful book of stories and talking about what happens when I tell stories, whether true life stories or traditional stories in different situations. And the editor came to me because of her own experience and asked me if I would write this book. So that's what I'm doing at present.
Very well. You're an inspiration, Laura.
Thank you.
Totally. And I think we have to do another program because I think you have so much to say. Well, I just want to finish off on the fact that you're the mother of a best-selling author, Ishmael B.A. Forgive me.
That's a big story.
Yeah. Well, you see, let's save that for when you and Ishmael do a program with me, I'm going to invite Ishmael to do it, and I want to just finish off on this. If our audience wants to speak to you or find out more information about your books and the different kinds of programs that you do on peace and various other things, how do they get to you?
Well, first of all, people can write to me at Laura's office, Lauras office, OFFICE @yahoo.com. And I have a website. In fact, if anybody listening is a great website designer and would like to help me update it, my website is www.laurasims.com.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of information there, and also you can read articles and see videos, and there is a marketplace. I'll tell you what I'd love to do when I come back.
Tell me.
I would love to do a little workshop with you, because I think I do a workshop in New York called The Stories We Tell and How We Tell Them. We're helping people to tell personal stories, life stories. And I think everyone really loves to do that, and very often is really caught up telling sort of litany of events, or doesn't really know how to shape a story that is their kind of gift to their children or their family or their friends. So I really love doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, my guest today has been Laura Sims, an award-winning performer, writer, and educator. And I want to thank you, Laura Sims, for being on the Susan Brender Show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.